ఎంతమంది వచ్చారు స్టూడెంట్స్ అలా వచ్చిన వాళ్ళు నెక్స్ట్ యాడ్ అవుతారా ప్రజెంట్ ఎంతమంది ఉన్నారు 80 ఉన్నారు యాడ్ అవుతారు కదా ఓకే గుడ్ మార్నింగ్ స్టూడెంట్స్ this is Dr. Ramesh, Associate Professor of Surgery. Last time we were talking about diverticulosis and small bowel tumors and everything. And by the time I thought I might have completed inflammatory bowel diseases. But later I was informed by Honorable HOD that ulcerative colitis has been left over. So let us speak something about ulcerative colitis. And before entering into the topic, I would like to insist that unless you are unfortunate, you are unlikely to get a question on ulcerative colitis in its long format. And however, you are likely to get a short question, something like toxic megacolon. And second point is, this topic is of utmost importance from your need point of examination, because a lot of potential bits are there. Okay, so what is an inflammatory bowel disease? You might be knowing the definition of inflammatory bowel disease by this time, because you have been covered about Crohn's disease. And any idiopathic inflammation of the small and large bowels is termed as inflammatory bowel disease, and Crohn's stands number one, and ulcerative colitis is the other. And in between the two, the other variant is also there, that is indeterminate colitis. We'll speak about as it comes on. Okay, my dear students, let's get into the class. So what is ulcerative colitis? Ulcerative colitis may be defined as an inflammatory bowel disease, and it is a disease of the rectum and colon associated with extraintestinal manifestations. And these extraintestinal manifestations, they occur as the duration as well as severity of the disease progresses. And ulcerative colitis, by sex-wise, it is supposed to be more equally distributed between males and females, occurring unfortunately in early part, that is 20 to 40 years of age. But it's practically seen that as the age advances, probably male population dominate or outnumber females in the occurrence of the cases. And why we are interested in ulcerative colitis is it has got propensity for the malignant transformation, number one. And number two, it has got some grave complications like colonic perforation, toxic megacolon, sepsis like this. And it's hard to believe that it's a topic of interest in countries like India or Asian countries, because it is more common in USA and Europe, especially in Western Europe, because most of you might be going on MLE basis or PLAB basis to these countries. You are supposed to know this very well. And incidence is somewhere around 6 to 10 per 1 lakh population, but prevalence is about 160 per 1 lakh population. Here one interesting topic is in 2018 in India, especially in northern countries, northern states, especially in Punjab, one random controlled trial was done, and ulcerative colitis in India has been reported to be about 6.2 per 1 lakh incidence, which is significant. And by this time of 2 years, then the population was 125 crores out, now of course nearly 140 crores. So ulcerative colitis is also on rampage. So it's rare in East, and it's rare in tropical countries. It's rare in Mediterranean belt. And one interesting thing about the etiology, coming to the etiology of ulcerative colitis, is those Asians who were born and brought up in Asia under the age of 14 years, ulcerative colitis is supposed to be very rare. But those Asians who were born and brought up in United Kingdom, ulcerative colitis is significantly higher and on par with European population. That means that there is a certain evidence that environmental factors might be one of the causative factors. Okay, let's go into the etiology. Etiology, as it comes under IBD, we know that etiology is grossly unknown. Grossly unknown. The remaining postulated hypothetical etiological factors might be, the first one is genetic, because in about 10 to 20% of the population suffering from ulcerative colitis, there is a certain relation between the first degree relative might have suffered either from the Crohn's disease or from the ulcerative colitis. And second thing is, when the colitis is active, there has been an observation that there was particular reduction in the number of anaerobic bacteria. But here we have to remember again that so far no positive organism have been isolated from the ulcerative colitis, so that as to put as the positive factor, but that was an observation. And third thing is smoking. Peculiarly, smoking seems to be protective in case of ulcerative colitis, unlike Crohn's, where it is causative. And so nowadays, nicotine trial therapy is also going on. Probably in few decades, it might be implemented as one of the treatment options. But I don't advise you to smoke for this purpose. So that's there. And fourth thing is some of the relapses of the ulcerative colitis, because these inflammatory bowel diseases, whether Crohn's or ulcerative, and more particularly ulcerative colitis, is known for relapses and remissions and relapses. And relapses are closely associated with the periods of mental stress. There might be a relapse. But again, the psychological profile and personality profiles of these patients are no more different from normal community people. So, grossly speaking, etiology is unknown, but these are some of the postulated things. So, coming to pathology. So, what is the exact pathology of ulcerative colitis? Virtually all cases of ulcerative colitis start from the rectum. By definition, it is ulcerative colitis is a disease of rectum extending proximally to the colon, along with extraintestinal manifestations in severe cases, isn't it? So virtually all cases of ulcerative colitis start from the rectum and gradually they extend into the colon. And when they do so, the colonic inflammation, you remember, it's not rectal inflammation, it is the colonic inflammation, which diffuse, confluent, conglomerate, and superficial, right? It is diffuse and confluent. There is nothing like a patchy involvement, nothing like that. Patchy involvement goes in favor of Crohn's disease. Skip lesions go in favor of Crohn's disease, but not in case of ulcerative colitis. It is a diffuse and confluent disease. And superficial. Superficial means it limits itself to the mucosa and superficial submucosa. Classically, an ulcerative colitis confines itself to the mucosa and superficial part of the submucosa. Lamina propria layer వరకు ఉంటుంది, Leberkuhn cells వరకు ఉంటుంది, crypts ఉంటాయి కదా Leberkuhn cells లో అంతవరకు ఉంటుంది. So that's what the next point lies, pseudopolyposis. There might be pseudopolyposis in a quarter of the cases, because what happens in case of remissions, whenever the patient is in a phase of remission, the mucosal nodularity will be there. Those mucosal nodules typically look like a polyp, and that's why that is called, that's not actually a polyp, that's a sessile mass, and that's why we call it a pseudopolyp, and it occurs in 25% of the cases. And whenever you happen to find a case of stricture in a case of ulcerative colitis, it's highly unlikely that it is associated with a stricture, but stricture is rare, and you should suspect coexisting malignancy. And it becomes predominantly more so because in those small unfortunate number of patients, those who develop irregular mucosal swellings, both on colonoscopy as well as on histopathological examinations, we call it as DALMS, that is diffuse association of lesions with masses, DALMS, is not there. Diffuse association of lesions and masses, and these, whenever there is a preponderance of DALMS, chances of malignancy stand more. Okay. On histopathological examination or biopsy, we may happen to find cryptapsis, because there is why these cryptapsis occur is, I said the inflammation is limited to the mucosa and superficial part of the submucosa, where these inflammatory mediators, they sink into the crypts of Liverpool and they form abscess. That's why it is called cryptapsis, which is the characteristic thing about ulcerative colitis. ఇలాంటి బిట్స్ వస్తాయి PG exam, cryptapsis is seen in associated with there is a definitive depletion of mucin production by the goblet cells. And what happens next is, as the time progresses and with time, there will be some histological changes leading to dysplasia. Dysplasia is obviously a pre-malignant condition, and again it may be low-grade dysplasia and high-grade dysplasia. High-grade dysplasia is the one thing which is to be seriously considered, because it is associated with coincidental colorectal malignancy especially in about 40% of the cases, whereas about low-grade dysplasias, the exact course may vary, but it also harbors about 10 to 20% of malignancies. And the action of treatment in case of low-grade dysplasias is a bit controversial. But some of the low-grade dysplasias might turn into malignant transformation in its low-grade dysplasia stage itself without transformation to high-grade dysplasia, favoring a total colectomy procedure in favor of these changes. Okay, that's about histopathological examination. And coming to the clinical features, they largely depend on the extent of the disease. We should remember here that it is a disease of the rectum. In 90% of the cases, it is confined to the rectum. That means it is confined to the stage of proctitis. So there won't be any extraintestinal manifestations. There won't be any systemic illness, and the features are local only. There may be occasional rectal bleeding, and there may be tenesmus. That means sense of incomplete evacuation of the bowels. That's what we call tenesmus, associated with mucus discharge because of the active cryptapsis that might be discharging mucus as well, but not because of goblet cells. I have mentioned that goblet cells, they deplete the production of mucin. Okay. So classically, if the feature of ulcerative colitis is a rectal bleeding along with mucus discharge, along with diarrhea. That's what classically described in textbooks. But remember that in 90% of the cases, it is confined to the stage of proctitis, and there will be rectal bleeding, but there may be minimal rectal bleeding, but associated with the tenesmus and mucus discharge. And pain is highly unlikely in these patients. And of course, what happens next? It extends to the colitis stage. Yes, now there is definitive bloody diarrhea will be there. Along with, to add on this, there will be urgency. And bloody diarrhea. We should suspect probably this patient is going to land into colitis. And what happens in extensive colitis? Now, to super add on this, there will be systemic manifestations from the patient. So because of the ongoing loss of blood, patient will be anemic, obviously hypoproteinemic, and electrolyte disturbances may be there. Here, fluid disturbances are a bit unlikely, but electrolyte disturbances are common, especially in the form of hypokalemia and hypochloremia. And systemic features, again, like fever, malaise, anorexia, weakness, lethargy, all these things will be there when the colitis is extensive. And in case of children or young adults, it particularly won't affect children too much, but I said no, it starts from roughly around the third decade or so. So in these adults, there is again impaired growth is there. This is one point of concern from surgical point of view, which I will mention later. And when it is severe extensive colitis, or I think in case of fulminant colitis, extraintestinal manifestations also may superadd. extraintestinal manifestations will come into the picture along with the systemic illness, systemic manifestations, along with the bloody diarrhea and tenesmus. Patient will be having fever this time. So what are these extraintestinal manifestations? Extraintestinal manifestations, they are peculiar to ulcerative colitis. Number one is arthritis. Arthritis, it is supposed to be seen in 15% of the cases of ulcerative colitis. And arthritis of ulcerative colitis is classically, it is polyarthropathy of large joints, especially knee joints, ankle joints, elbows, and wrists. These are the joints that are likely to be involved. And second thing is there may be sacroiliitis and ankylosing spondylitis. The ankylosing spondylitis, especially in its sacroiliitis form, is 20 times more common in patients with ulcerative colitis and typically associated with what is the genotype, if I'm not wrong, HLA-B27, right? HLA-B27, it will be strong association will be there. And third thing is there may be sclerosing cholangitis. Here I need to mention a point. Whenever, yes, in case of ulcerative colitis, there is definitive increase in the cases of sclerosing colitis in its primary form only. So sclerosing colitis in association with ulcerative colitis can lead to increased malignant transformation or increased incidence of colorectal cancer. And second thing is, this sclerosing colitis is highly unlikely to be transformed into cholangiocarcinoma. Don't get confused between the two, because cholangiocarcinoma in its primary form, is nowhere different in frequency in ulcerative colitis patients. Kindly remember this. Because sclerosing cholangitis is there, of course, it can gradually go into cirrhosis, or the patient may go into hepatocellular failure and coma, and these features can happen. And so, presuming that if the patient is having cholangiocarcinoma, patient might be developing a cholangiocarcinoma, no, I will do colectomy now to improve the patient status. No, nothing. That won't happen. So, sclerosing cholangitis is different from cholangiocarcinoma. But this sclerosing cholangitis that won't transform into cholangiocarcinoma in ulcerative colitis patients with any more increased frequency. Okay. Yes, another thing is there may be skin lesions. Skin lesions, erythema nodosum may be there, along with pyoderma gangrenosum. That's again another embarrassing situation to the patient. And these skin lesions classically improve if you manage the colitis symptoms properly. Okay. Next point is eye lesions. Eye lesions, all these are important postgraduate bits for you. Eye lesions may be in the form of uveitis or episcleritis. You remember the eye lesions that may come as uveitis or episcleritis. These are the extraintestinal manifestations that are likely to be seen in case of ulcerative colitis. Okay, there is basically a classification for the colitis. It largely is determined by the frequency of the bowel movements along with presence or absence of systemic signs of illness. So it is called a mild attack whenever there are less than 4 stools per day, passage of only 4 stools per day, with or without bleeding, but obviously no toxic symptoms, no systemic, no symptoms and signs of systemic illness. And we call it as moderate if it is more than 4 stools per day, plus minimal systemic illness features may be there, and anemia usually in its mild form, and abdominal pain may come here. Remember, now I am saying abdominal pain when classifying colitis, and while mentioning the clinical features, I said classically abdominal pain is absent. I said pain is absent in case of ulcerative colitis, not abdominal pain. Okay, it may be associated with raised inflammatory markers. They are non-specific, but they will be raised, like erythrocyte sedimentation ratio, ESR, or sometimes a CRP. They may be elevated. And now we call it as a severe stage of colitis when the patient passes more than 6 per day, stools of more than 6 per day, plus definitive association with of systemic illness features. And here, to add on that, hypoalbuminemia is common in these conditions. That means that the patient is going to malnutrition status, and it is an ominous finding because why we will come to know. This point we have to remember. I have mentioned, I think I have last time mentioned whenever we are speaking about diverticulosis, this hypoalbuminemia, the same thing holds good. Or whenever you are studying in your pediatrics, something about kwashiorkor or marasmus hypoalbuminemia, the same thing holds good. So anything less than 32 grams per deciliter is supposed to be ominous finding for hypoalbuminemia concerned, I believe. And last thing is fulminant. Fulminant variety, this is something passing more than 10 stools per day. Along with the patient will be having definitive fever, obvious tachycardia will be there, and here the bleeding is continuous, ongoing, making the patient completely anemic, hypoalbuminemic, and this time abdominal tenderness will be there along with the distension, and the anemia goes to that extent that there is a persistent need for blood transfusions, and worsen the situation, there may be progressive colonic dilatation, and that's what is called toxic megacolon. Toxic megacolon happens to be seen in severe cases where the progressive colonic dilatation to a significant level leading to disintegrative colitis, that is called toxic megacolon. But you have to remember here the pathology. కొద్దిగా మనం తక్కువ ఆలోచిస్తే తెలుస్తుంది. డిజెంటిగ్రేటివ్ కాలైటిస్ వచ్చినప్పుడు ఇన్ఫ్లమేటరీ మీడియేటర్స్ రిలీజ్ అయిపోయి పేషెంట్ సెప్టిక్ షాక్లోకి వెళ్ళిపోయి ఏఆర్డిఎస్లోకి వెళ్ళిపోయి డిక్లోకి ఏమీ వెళ్ళిపోదు. ఎందుకంటే కనుక అల్సరేటివ్ కాలైటిస్లో డిసీజ్ ఈజ్ కన్ఫైన్డ్ ఇట్ సెల్ఫ్ టు mucosa and to certain extent of submucosa, isn't it? But what gradually happens, now we'll see. It is an indication for emergency surgery if colonic perforation has to be avoided, right? Because colonic perforation is a grave condition, taking away the lives in nearly half of the patients if you miss the diagnosis and if you don't do proper surgery, proper intervention, proper timely intervention of surgery is not there. So it is an indication for emergency surgery if colonic perforation is to be avoided. 5% of the patients develop ultimately toxic megacolon. Unfortunately, only 70%, once the patient develops toxic megacolon or once you suspect toxic megacolon, only medically you can manage 70% in intensive care unit setup, but the remaining 30% you have to take care. So what are the things? Severe abdominal pain. It's mentioned that there is severe abdominal pain. Yes, now you can get severe abdominal pain because there will be gradual extension of inflammation from the layer to layer here, making the colonic pain worsened, so that all the layers of the colon are involved here because of rapid inflammation, because of secondary to dilatation, and there will be abdominal distension whenever there is obvious colonic distension is there, abdominal distension is there, but not something like what you see in Ogilvie syndrome or pseudocolonic obstruction. That's not that. This is genuine, what is it called, inflammatory process. That's why it's leading to abdominal distension. There may not be particularly associated with ileus, so bowel movements will be there. So there will be, the patient will be passing huge number of passes, huge number of feces. And yes, you have to follow radiologically with the help of X-ray. The colonic diameter, it goes on gradually extending, and if the diameter increases more than 6 centimeters of transverse colon, diameter of transverse colon, if it extends more than 6 centimeters, and on X-ray, if you can make out mucosal islands or presence of intramural gas, your diagnosis is certain that the patient is having toxic megacolon. And in these conditions, to worsen the thing, there will be reduced stool frequency. There may be reduced stool frequency, giving you a confusing picture that, oh, medical management treatment anta bagundi. So it's not like that. It seems that there is a reduction of stool frequency. That's not an improvement sign, because it might be associated with a sudden increase in pulse and temperature. Progressive colonic dilatation is there. So if this is the scenario, and if you are giving medical management, and if there is no improvement despite medical management, within 48 hours you have to intervene along with your medical gastroenterologist. Okay, he will give some of the anti-inflammatory agents pertaining to the ulcerative colitis, which I am going to tell you shortly. But your role as a surgeon is probably to go for laparotomy to do whatsoever is required. And steroids may mask the physical signs, because as a part of the medical management, you might be administering steroids to these patients with a hope to cure the flare up. But the condition got worsened, and typical guarding or uh, abdominal distension also may be masked at some times with the use of steroids. Yes, certainly steroids may mask physical signs, and you have to be careful. You have to use your brains. And colonic perforation is a grave complication with 40% mortality. That's what I have already mentioned. And impending colonic perforation is an indication for emergency surgery. And already if colonic perforation is there and patient is under you, that is your mistake, that you have missed your diagnosis. Please remember this. And lastly, severe hemorrhage, in spite of reduced stool frequency, sometimes there may be over hemorrhage, severe hemorrhage that is highly uncommon, that occurs only in 1 or 2% of the cases. But sometimes to control the hemorrhage also, you have to go for laparotomy only. And the procedure of choice in these patients as a first aid is subtotal colectomy and ileostomy. Subtotal colectomy, we will remove colon subtotally, and we do an ileostomy, because you have to remember that the patient is in frail condition, or the patient might be steroid dependent, and the patient might be malnourished. So he may not be fit for a restorative procedures in these conditions. So you have to go for a subtotal colectomy, where we remove whole of the colon, maybe up to we do remove the right colon, transverse colon, splenic flexor, sigmoid colon, and we stop there. We do exteriorize the rectosigmoid long stump, and we exteriorize that rectosigmoid stump to the outside to form as a distal mucous fistula. And it is very much probably tempting to close that stump. No, we are not supposed to do that, because the condition of the patient might get worsened because of degenerative colitis. He may develop pelvic abscess and ultimately sepsis and all the fatal consequences. Instead of that, we exteriorize that loop, form a distal mucous fistula. Distal mucous fistula, that's not a fecal fistula. Distal mucous fistula. And second thing is, by doing so, you can skip off all the possible complications of leaving the rectal stump intact. That means you are potentially, you now need not get scared of pelvic abscess or sepsis like this. And second advantage is, once through the fecal fistula is there, you can give 5-amino salicylic acid compounds or rectal enemas might be administered to minimize the rectal component of ulcerative colitis. And because you have removed all these part of the colon, now you do an endoileostomy, through which the fecal matter and flatus comes out, and put ileostomy bags, as we have discussed in the last class. So ultimately, once the patient's general condition improves, or he comes out of malnutrition, or probably he might become steroid independent. I mean, from the steroid dependency, he might come out. Now, there is every chance that you can go for pouch surgery or restorative surgeries likewise. But now, in an emergency setup, the first aid is, you have to remember, the procedure of choice is subtotal colectomy only, of course with endoileostomy, right? So what is the risk of cancer in these patients? We have discussed this topic as important because of the propensity of the malignant transformation. Yes, risk of cancer increases with duration. That's mentioned there. Risk of cancer increases with duration of the disease from the diagnosis, and also the onset at which the disease has started. These are the two things that influence the cancer risk. It is supposed to be 1% transformation is there by the end of the 10 years after diagnosis. The rate rapidly rises to 10 to 15% after 20 years, and maybe 20% of patients land up in rectal cancer if duration is more than 30 years. And patients with pancolitis of more than 10 years duration, pancolitis means, as far as particularly ulcerative colitis is involved, there are two different terms, pancolitis and total involvement of the colon. Usually, unless otherwise mentioned, pancolitis means total only. But in ulcerative colitis, pancolitis by definition comes by extension of inflammation beyond the splenic flexure is called pancolitis. Need not necessarily be total colon. So pancolitis, if it is there, and the duration of the disease, if it is more than 10 years, there is definitive indication for colonoscopy screening or colonoscopy surveillance in these patients to rule out any malignancy or dysplasia. Okay. So carcinoma is more likely if the whole colon is involved. Yes, that's what I have mentioned. Not only pancolitis, if all the colon is involved, or if the disease started early in life, yes, malignancy in these cases is often atypical. It is often high-grade malignancy and occur at many sites at once. So that what we do, we have to go for multiple biopsies, skipping of 10 centimeters, 10 centimeters, 10 centimeters, likewise throughout the colon when we are doing colonoscopy, take out multiple biopsies and see whether there is any DLMS or diffuse associated lesions or masses, or if there is any dysplasias of high-grade dysplasias that will occur either on flat mucosa or DLM. So that's what I have mentioned. Chromoendoscopy. Chromoendoscopy is not an endoscopy procedure. That is a dye-sprayed colonoscopy. Colonoscopy surveillance where we give a dye and we do colonoscopy and take multiple biopsies every 10 centimeters and look for any certain mucosal abnormalities are there, which can occur either in a flat mucosa, a DLMS, and associated abnormalities with the DLMS carry more chances of malignant transformation, isn't it? So what are the investigations fundamentally we carry on? I think we are running short of time. I want to go quick. So sigmoidoscopy in its rigid or flexible sigmoidoscopy, it is an OPD procedure. You can detect proctitis. Yes, you can see through colonoscopy, sigmoidoscope, the mucosa is hyperemic, bleeds on touch of the instrument here, and associated with something like purulent accident or mucopurulent accident will be there. And if sometimes already the patient is having remissions and relapses, multiple remissions and relapses, and if you have done your sigmoidoscopy at the time of remission phase, you might have seen pseudopolyps, that is regenerative mucosal nodules. I have mentioned it. And in some cases, you may just see tiny ulcers, tiny multiple ulcers. And if you follow up that case, there may be coalition of these ulcers to form multiple ulcers, only shallow multiple ulcers, but of varying sizes. This is you are supposed to take a biopsy. And what happens after you take biopsy? And this colonoscopy and biopsy, they help you, number one, to establish the extent of inflammation. Anyway, whenever you are suspecting colonic dilatation or toxic megacolon, colonoscopy is contraindicated for the fear of impending perforation, for the fear of causing perforation, right? Second thing is to distinguish ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And of course, it's possible, but it may not be true so in each and every case. Number three, to monitor response to the treatment. Number four, to assess the long-standing cases for any possible malignancy. Okay. Now, coming to the radiology, as I mentioned, in a case of acute setting, X-ray in an intensive care unit, in a bedridden patient, yes, you do plain X-ray abdomen, and if it gives those signs, what I have mentioned, like mural gas shadows are there, or the colonic dilatation gradually extending to more than 6 centimeters, yes, it can give a definitive conclusion that it's going to be toxic megacolon. plain X-ray abdomen indicates indication in case of severity, indicates severity in case of acute settings. Second thing is barium minima. Of course, contrast barium minima they are used, but now CT dominates that. But this is again an important postgraduate question. A classic appearance of featureless colon on contrast enema, on contrast barium enema, double contrast barium enema is suggestive of ulcerative colitis. Okay, what is there on CT scan? CT scan, there may be significant thickening of the colonic wall along with inflammatory stranding of the colonic mesentery. If the disease is confined to beyond the rectum, we may find out this significant thickening of the colonic wall along with inflammatory stranding of the mesentery. And of course, sometimes bacteriology is done. We send, obtain fecal specimen of the patient and send it to the microbiology department. Basically, it's done to exclude infective colitis, especially with Campylobacter, it's jejuni variety, Campylobacter jejuni. And another thing is Clostridium difficile. Clostridium difficile is positive and putative in case of pseudomembranous colitis, and very difficult to distinguish these two colitides, infective colitides from ulcerative colitis. Yes, we do so. And what is treatment? Coming to the treatment, treatment is multidisciplinary. Multidisciplinary means, yes, you need to have a gastroenterologist, you need to have a nurse, you need to have a stomach care specialist, and you need to have an intensivist, along with, of course, you being a surgeon, and along with a social care worker. All these multidisciplinary approach means that, and basically they are divided into medical management and surgical management. Coming to the medical management, basically ulcerative colitis is an inflammatory bowel disease. So what we do, we give anti-inflammatories, right? So what are the anti-inflammatories we give? Number one, 5 amino-salicylic acid derivatives, 5 ASA derivatives. They are cyclooxygenase inhibitors. They are used to something like to protect the colon from degradative reaching aspirin-like products. These COX inhibitors will be highly useful. So they are used as long-term and used as a maintenance therapy and keep the patient in the phase of remission. That is, they are highly useful. They can be given either topically or systemically. Second thing is corticosteroids. Of course, they are highly anti-inflammatory, you know that, and they are mainstay for flare-ups. Whenever there is relapse, then you do corticosteroids in high doses. Number third thing is immunosuppressive drugs to maintain remission. Once the flare-ups are controlled, now you go for immunosuppressive drugs like azathioprine, cyclosporine. They maintain remission, and they are highly useful to prevent steroid dependency. That's why we call them as steroid-sparing agents. Number 4 are monoclonal antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies are anti-tumor necrosis factor alpha agents like infliximab or adalimumab. They are given because this TNF alpha, once it gets activated, it activates complement system, it invites the sepsis and ultimately goes into the cellular level to damage the mitochondria. And that is the point when the patient may go into the ARDS because of the sepsis. And this prevents, these monoclonal antibodies prevent from happening that. That's why we call it anti-TNF agents like infliximab or adalimumab. And your gastroenterologist will help you delivering these agents to the patient. And the fifth thing, recently introduced an integrin blocker, what we call as vedolizumab. This comes as a rescue agent. Yes, the patient is having toxic colon, and I want to interfere by giving vedolizumab to this patient to potentially avoid surgery. Of course, it has given some wonders in some patients. Okay, this is the basically medical management. See, there are different things. Amino-salicylic acid derivatives, they are used for maintenance. Corticosteroids for flare-ups. Immunosuppressive drugs, to maintain remission again as steroid sparers. And monoclonal antibodies like TNF or integrin blockers like vedolizumab. This is for case of rescue, like emergency intensive setting. So what happens in acute colitis? Acute colitis, again, in case of mild attack, of course, you give a course of oral prednisolone, that is steroid, enough. In case of moderate attack, you go for oral prednisolone along with steroid enema twice daily and along with 5 amino-salicylic acid. Most of the times it's enough. And if it is not enough, in those unfortunate 10% of the cases, do admit them, observe them, assess for weight, assess for vitals, look for abdomen, whether there is any distension or whether there is an abdominal pain, you watch that. And again, along with urine output, you have to closely watch the stool chart in these cases because it is basically confined to bowels. And X-ray, take X-ray abdomen in supine position maybe 2 times a day, and correct any fluid imbalance or electrolyte imbalance is there, any nutritional imbalance is there, go for total parenteral nutrition, correct anemia with blood transfusion if at any, and give high V hydrocortisone 4 to 6 times per day, and maybe rectal steroids in those patients in whom we can give. And in spite of doing all these things, observing the patient for 48 hours or so, probably an impending colonic perforation is awaiting you, and it is certainly do so. If it is more than 3 to 5 days, there is no other go other than to go for laparotomy and to decide what happens. So what are the indications for surgical treatment? Yes, medicines we have discussed. Being surgeons, now let us decide what is the surgical management. So greatest surgical intervention, possibility of surgical intervention is greatest during the first year after diagnosis. This may look a bit clumsy, but this implies that the diagnosis of ulcerative colitis has been made probably very delayed. So the surgical intervention risk is greatest in the first year after diagnosis, and risk of colectomy stands as high as 20% of cases in cases of ulcerative colitis. So let us see the indications. Yes, fulminating disease, whenever there is failed response to the medical management, along with the chronic disease leading to the patient with anemia or frequent stools, urgency, tenesmus like this, steroid dependent diseases, that means probably disease is not that much severe, but he is unable to maintain a remission phase without steroids. That's not good factor. So those steroid dependent diseases, yes, we do consider for surgery. And the fourth thing is inability of the patient to tolerate medical therapy. So some patients might be unable to tolerate steroids. Some patients might be unable to tolerate immunosuppressive drugs like azathioprine that may cause acute pancreatitis. Pancreatitis start trying the so certain drugs in acute pancreatitis cover చేస్తుంటారు సారు, లేకపోతే కార్టికోస్టెరాయిడ్స్ అని, ఈస్ట్రోజన్స్ అని చెప్పి, ఆ ఓరల్ కాంట్రాసెప్టివ్ పిల్స్ అని, లేకపోతే అజాథియోప్రిన్ అని, లేకపోతే థైజాయిడ్ డయూరిటిక్స్ అని, లేకపోతే వాల్ప్రిక్ యాసిడ్ అని చెప్పేసి, లేకపోతే ఆస్పర్జినేజ్ అని చెప్పి, దీస్ ఆర్ ద డ్రగ్స్ దట్ కెన్ కాజ్ acute pancreatitis, right? Acute pancreatitis is not a joke to tolerate. So next thing is there may be neoplastic changes. Yes, you are suspecting some dysplasia on colonoscopy or biopsy proven malignancy is there. Yes, there are extra intestinal manifestations are there. No, again, stop here. We don't go for surgery every time. Think your brain, put your brain and go for surgery, because it is the arthropathy that responds to surgery very well, along with pyoderma gangrenosum. These two things, they respond to surgery, they respond to colectomy, but not the remaining things of skin lesions or extra intestinal manifestations like uveitis. You can't do na kannu bavalegu babu ante potta kosadu antaru adayinda. So uveitis and episcleritis, they don't improve with colectomies. And of course, last rare condition like severe hemorrhage or stenosis causing intestinal obstruction, they are rare, but sometimes we may have to go for laparotomy. So what is the operative management? First thing is emergency, and second thing is elective. In emergency, only one surgery, that is the first aid surgery. Go for subtotal colectomy along with end ileostomy, which procedure I have explained. Whereas in conservative surgeries, there are 4 options for us. Okay, let us look for emergency. In case of malnourished, steroid dependent emergency situation, first aid procedure is subtotal colectomy and ileostomy. Rectosigmoid stump is brought out as mucus fistula. Advantage is avoidance of pelvic operation, and second thing is we remove the total colon at once, right? So you can totally assess histopathologically along with the colonic which part of the colon has been involved or not. So so that advantage is also there in case of emergency setting. And restorative surgeries can be done later once the patient improves. So what are the elective surgery? Again, in case of elective surgeries, indications: failure to medical therapy, steroid dependence, yes, growth retardation in case of children, extra intestinal diseases, and there is whenever there is involvement of suspicion of malignancy or proven malignancy. So what are different procedures? First procedure is subtotal colectomy and ileostomy. That's what we have mentioned as emergency setup, right? But here also we can do electively as an emergency or as an elective emergency. But here we don't, yes, we had done colonoscopy, right side colon is good. Yes, whether we can leave it, no, don't do that, because ulcerative colitis is known to extend and involve all the colon. So no segmental resections have never to be tried in case of ulcerative colitis. And these are done in a frail patients who cannot be weaned off from steroids. And second thing is, whenever there is a doubt, in those 10% of cases, that whether don't know whether you are dealing with an ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease and there is no other go, you go for subprotocolectomy and do an endoleostomy. And second thing is proctocolectomy and ileostomy. Procto means rectum and colectomy means remove the rectum, colon, everything and do ileostomy. So what happens if you remove everything? You remove risk of colitis and you remove the risk of malignancy, right? This is easy to do surgery, but it is a lower complication rate, but leaving the patient with stoma intact, because that is not a restorative procedure. You are doing proctocolectomy and you are doing ileostomy, right? And that means you are leaving a permanent stoma to the patient. And in about 20% of the cases, what happens is the remaining part of the perineal wound that resists to heal, and that causes a lot of problems to these patients. So that is the real problem. That's why what's exactly done is we go for intersphincteric excision of the anus here, intersphincteric excision of the anus, so that there will be smaller perineal wound and there will be smaller chances of wound recurrence, and there will be better chances of wound healing. So an intersphincteric excision of the anus is to be done. And however, this procedure has to be done only in those patients with intact sphincters. And if there is sphincter problem, you cannot do proctocolectomy. So, sorry, you cannot, it is indicated for patients only with sphincter problems. I'm sorry. Whenever there is sphincter incontinence, the proctocolectomy will be extremely helpful. We cannot restore restorative proctocolectomy, we cannot do, or restorative surgery, pouch surgeries we cannot do in case of damaged sphincters. In those cases, that is ideal to do proctocolectomy and do ileostomy. That is indicated with patients with sphincter problems, and sometimes some patients' preference, we will do that, because one thing I want to tell, patients' preference comes in case of young females who are yet to be married or about to complete their families. We don't go for pouch surgeries because there is a potential problem of pouch vaginal fistula, which is very much embracing thing. And second thing is, whenever we are doing rectal dissection, we are dealing with something like perineal nerves, and that may damage what is called we may denerve the vaginal secretory glands, and there will be dryness of the vagina causing dyspareunia to the patient. That is again another problem. And there may be erectile dysfunctions in case of males, and bladder dysfunction in case of both males and females. And these are the problems. That's why sometimes for patients' preference, this procedure is ideal. And close rectal dissection, we do rectal dissection close to the wall of the rectum to avoid erectile as well as bladder dysfunction problems whenever you are doing these procedures. The third thing is, and most commonly done procedure, is restorative proctocolectomy with ilioanal pouch named after parts. That is, what we do is we create an intestinal reserve or pouch. We create a pouch, something like to create an effect of rectum with the help of distal small bowel loops, that is the distal ileal loops. They come in various forms, whether it's inverted J shape or W shape or S shape, but most commonly done is J shaped. J-shaped procedure, that's what we call J pouch, that acts as a reservoir. And we do restorative proctocolectomy, and this pouch acts as a reservoir through which the continent sphincters are there. The patient can pass out mucus, and sometimes 3 to 8 times per day he will have to pass his motions per day. And 50% of the patients are happy with this procedure. Now let us see rapidly. This is reserved for patients with adequate anal sphincters. Yes, sphincter incontinence, we can't do that because flatus as well as faeces CPs will be there, and the highly incontinence, both diurnal as well as nocturnal incontinence of fecal matter, is highly embarrassing to the patient. And out of all the pouches I have mentioned, J pouch is most popular. And there is a controversy to do, how to do and how not about these procedures. Whether to do anastomosis at the level of the dentate line or above. Just to mention, if you do at the level of the dentate line, there is high chances of nocturnal incontinence, there is a fecal incontinence, but there is minimal chance of malignancy. If you go above the anal margin, there is high chance of, or at least theoretical chance of getting malignant transformation, but there is very low chance of fecal incontinence. That's controversial, but most of them do only high level only. And complications are, yes, pelvic infection is a complication, along with maybe 20% of the cases land up in pelvic infections, and 15% of the cases land up in post-op subacute small bowel obstruction. And unfortunate young females may land up in pouch vaginal fistulae. And the frequency of evacuation of the pouch is dependent on pouch volume, completeness of the emptying, whether there is a pouchitis or there is reservoir inflammation or intrinsic mobility of the small bowel. But ultimately, managed to get 3 to 8 motions per day is good enough. And increased frequency, urgency, incontinence, all these complications are have been reported by in a ratio of 20%, 5%, 5% likewise. And 50% of the patients are happy with this procedure, 35% are unhappy, but they still prefer to keep their pouch intact, and 15% are, yes, that is definitely causes poor function and pouchitis. We have to remove the pouch, no option. And pouchitis, there may be inflammation, dysfunction, systemic illness. The reason is unknown, but something like very much related to inflammatory bowel disease, because pouchitis won't occur in other surgeries, where pouch creation is indicated, but only in case of what we call inflammatory bowel disease. Ulcerative colitis pouch this poses this particular problem, and there may be altered bacteria flora, but most of the times it responds well to ciprofloxacin or metronidazole, right? And fourth thing is colectomy and ileorectal anastomosis. Yes, whenever there is minimal rectal inflammation, we do colectomy, and ileum and rectum are both anastomosed. Yes, there is no sexual dysfunction because pelvic nerves are intact. There is no stoma. Everything is fine, but potentially you are leaving the rectum intact, so you have to go on doing the colonoscopy every time, and you go on doing rectal inflammation, which responds very well to the management by the anti-ASC agents and steroids. But unfortunately, function is poor, but most of the times they are not doing that. Okay. And in between variety is called indeterminate colitis. Sometimes post surgery may be done only with minimal results. And last thing is Crohn's disease of the colon. Colon may be involved in 30% of the cases in association with perineal disease along with the small bowel, and symptoms may be with the colitis and proctitis. Toxic megacolon is rare. Colonic strictures are common here in Crohn's, and it is technically difficult to differentiate which is Crohn's and which is ulcerative, especially when the rectum and colon are involved, because it's highly unlikely in case of Crohn's disease to involve these two things. Small bowel is more common, right? Of course, it can involve right from stomach throughout the GAT, but skip lesions and rectal sparing and perianal disease and non-caseating granulomas, all these things go in favor of Crohn's disease. And if you do colonoscopy, there may be patchy inflammation. That means there may be areas of normal colon in between areas of inflamed mucosa, which are irregular, ulcerated, associated with mucopurulent exudate. There may be an early stage after ulceration surrounded by erythematous mucosa, which gradually get deepened and following the formation of strictures formation. And an irregular Crohn's stricture with polypoid mucosa is classically indistinguishable from malignancy on appearance by colonoscopy. And treatment is, you can do all surgeries, that's what I have mentioned, except pouch surgery, because Crohn's can occur anywhere in case of perineal disease. Pouch surgery is contraindicated, but if your diagnosis is confirmed that it is a Crohn's disease and nothing else, segmental rather than total colectomy may be appropriate. Okay, to finish off, just let us go through what is the differentiation between ulcerative and Crohn's disease. Macroscopically, ulcerative disease distribution, colon and rectum, but Crohn's disease anywhere in the GAT. And perianal disease, fistula formation, strictures, they are rare in ulcerative colitis. Yes, very much common in Crohn's disease. Microscopically, the layers involved are mucosa and submucosa only in case of ulcerative colitis, whereas full thickness is involved in case of Crohn's disease. That's why stricture formation is very much common there. And the second thing is granulomas, fissuring on histopathology. They are common in Crohn's, but not very much rare in ulcerative colitis. Whereas crypt abscess is a classic of ulcerative colitis, but never seen in case of Crohn's disease. All right, these things. This what extract from Bailey. Bailey, you just go through Bailey once so that you don't have any more confusion about ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. This is very much important topic to you. And this is classic ulcerative colitis. These are the pouches that I have mentioned. This is J pouch, W pouch, and S pouch. This is Crohn's disease of the colon. And thank you. Sorry that I might have gone a bit late, because next time I think we have to go. We'll go with some other topic, maybe intestinal obstruction or appendix. It depends on what our HOD tells. And just any doubts? Thank you very much to one and all. Any doubts? Just please type. Just note my number, because I have gone rapidly. 9652 309 509. Okay, 9652 309 509. So can I type it here? This is my personal number. You feel free to ask me anywhere between 9 to 4. How to send this? Send. I think I have typed it there. Any doubts, or shall I come out? Girish? 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 The students, any doubts? మొత్తం అంతా డౌటేనా అసలు? ఏదో ఒకటి అడగండి. స్టిల్ సమ్ 3 minutes is left over. ఇది 7005 7111. Any doubts, please? Okay, then I'm waiting for 1 more minute. Girish? So I think your next teacher has come ready. So I presume there are no doubts, and if there are any doubts, please feel free to call me or ask me at the beginning of the next topic. Probably I will come up with something like intestinal obstruction or vermiform appendix we will do. Close చేసాక మా వాళ్ళకి ఏం డౌట్స్ ఉన్నప్పుడు నేను నెంబర్ పెడతాను. Okay, thank you. Bye.